Hello and welcome to Philosophy15. I'm Robert Talisse.
I'm Scott Aikin.
We are the authors together of Why We Argue and How We Should, a guide to political disagreement. And this is a series of unscripted conversations about philosophy that typically engage issues pertaining to or in the general neighborhood of the themes taken up in our book, Why We Argue. But Scott and I have been working on a different project, and we want to start talking a little bit about some of the themes that come up in that other project. We have a book coming out that's a collection of revised versions and updated versions of articles that we've published together on the broad themes of American pragmatism, pluralism, and questions about philosophical method or metaphilosophy, and the working title is Pragmatism, Pluralism, and the Nature of Philosophy. And in the course of working through some of those articles, roughly 16 or 17 articles, we got back to thinking about a topic about which we had published an article or two, that is the topic of what is called, often by people who intend to deride it, I think, analytic pragmatism, which is puzzling.
Yeah, it's used as a term of abuse by
why it would be a term of abuse
group
is puzzling.
Of folks. So, I think that only in the recent maybe 5-6 years, really since Brandom's Between Saying and Doing, has anybody described as an analytic pragmatist started using the term to describe themselves as such. But what exactly is that project that's getting described? So for the most part, analytic pragmatism, again, maybe just following Robert Brandom on it, is just that it's a view about pragmatism that it's kind of merged in with a good deal of the rest of the analytic philosophical program. A rough version of that view is just that the project of analysis is that you have a kind of a target vocabulary that you analyze in terms of another. Like you might say, you have a vocabulary that you use to explain how you say things in the other vocabulary. So, for example, logical empiricism, for example, is just the view that you've got your object languages and things like that, and you're able to explain in terms of reduction to experience what the things in the object language are and what your theoretical languages are. You give an account as to how you reduce that or explain the meanings in terms of those sorts of things. Logicism, for example, is a reduction of the vocabulary of arithmetic to the language of logic. And pragmatism, too, itself is, and its sort of founding documents really are programs of that analytic program, where what you do is you take a vocabulary and you state it in terms of another vocabulary. The vocabulary that you state things in terms of when pragmatism is practical results. So Peirce's pragmatic maxim, thinking about what the practical consequences of these certain objects or ideas are, is a criterion for what that is. James and the case of the squirrel going round the tree, being able to identify useful theoretical discussions, or ones that you'd say translate the differences between the views in terms of practical differences, and then you'll be able to figure out whether or not the projects are worth doing. Pragmatism itself is, as a consequence, you might say, a program with regards to meaning, analyzing those meanings in terms of a target vocabulary, the vocabulary of practice. And so pragmatism, in its very inception, was something that looked like it was on a sort of a merge road with the rest of the analytic program. Same kinds of projects, just a different target vocabulary, you might say, but similar kinds of projects. And so, yeah.
Can I let me just try to anticipate a little bit of pushback from those who would find what you're describing already a kind of perversion of pragmatism. So, to say that both analytic philosophy more generally and pragmatism properly understood more specifically is the philosophical project involving, or a philosophical project centrally involving rearticulation or the explanation of one vocabulary in terms of another does seem to embed the claim that philosophical reflection is about vocabularies,
Yes.
rather than about something else
About
that it could be
doings,
about. Yeah,
right,
about
yeah.
doings or about experiencings,
Right.
about undergoings.
Yeah.
And so I could imagine
Yeah, good.
somebody saying, well, look, the whole point of pragmatism is not to, the whole point of pragmatism properly understood, that is in its non-analytic variant, is not to start with and focus on and therefore end with language.
Right. Now, again, that in some ways is an argument for why pragmatism chooses, or pragmatism, you might say, valorizes the vocabulary of practice. Namely, that philosophy is a linguistic exercise. That's one of the first things, is that philosophy is a linguistic exercise. And so whenever we, you might say, do the wordy stuff, the objective with pragmatism is to do the wordy stuff in ways that are going to make practical differences down the road. So you might say, why is the target vocabulary the vocabulary of actions that you can take right here and now, or things that would be different in your practices? Is that philosophy is supposed to make a difference in the world, and so you do the theoretical work so that it pays certain kinds of practical dividends. So you might say, the merge narrative that I've been telling with regards to the vocabularies and language is one that the pragmatists would want to say, yeah, part of our metaphilosophy is that philosophy needs to make a difference. If it's just translation of vocabularies, that's it. The reason why we choose this vocabulary is because of the fact that it allows us to make a certain kind of difference. Let me say one other thing about why language matters, and it's not that I don't think that anybody wants to say that practical differences are ones that philosophers don't care much about whenever if they're not pragmatists, but that everyone's so language centered, and what's so special about speaking as opposed to gardening or wielding a hammer? And the answer is that you can't garden about hammering. You can't. So, and the thing is that you have the Nietzsche line, I want to philosophize with a hammer, but it's that you don't do the philosophy with the hammer. You do the philosophy with words, and then you do something with the hammer in light of it, maybe intimidate an opponent or something like that.
Or you use the words as hammers.
Or use the words as hammers, right? But there's still it's still a wordy exercise. So, so I think that there's still a way to tell the pragmatist story as still a centrally linguistic story, and one that makes it easy to tell the story of it merging with, you might say, more linguistically oriented philosophical programs. That still keeps pragmatism's core pragmatic flair.
Right. So,
there, however, is maybe one complication with this story that's worth highlighting here, which is pragmatism after. And so again, if you think that this merged story with pragmatism with broader analytic concerns is a plausible story, one of the lessons of mid 20th century to late 20th century analytic philosophy that was pragmatically inspired is the criticism of privileged vocabularies. Right?
Right.
And that complicates many of the stories, right? So it complicates, so for example, whenever Quine criticized the logical positivists for the reductionist program, trying to reduce all the terms in one vocabulary, all the vocabularies to the vocabulary of experience, that's a criticism that generalizes to really all of these reduction programs. And so as a consequence, it looks like it infects the pragmatist program too, that if there's no such thing as a privileged final vocabulary, that all vocabularies, you might say, or to use a kind of a Rortian phrase, there's no final vocabulary, right? You got final vocabularies, but they kind of shift and change depending on when you are, or where you are, or what you're doing. And so if that's the case, then it looks like a certain kind of pragmatist-inspired criticism of final vocabularies comes back on pragmatism too. And so it looks like analytic pragmatism now is one that isn't just about tracing it to practical vocabularies. It's one that, like Robert Brandom does, is that we can reduce it to certain sociological vocabularies. It looks like pragmatism now has a sort of an easy way to make a continuity with naturalism, that we can state these things in terms of certain scientific vocabularies, that's something that we can do, and it doesn't look like we would break any of our pragmatist scruples by building those bridges.
Well, so what's the alternative then to? Well, first of all, what's the alternative to analytic philosophy? If we've said that philosophy is this wordy enterprise, it's intrinsically connected to language and to the using of language to analyze other uses of language. Well, then it looks like if that's true about philosophy, then and if the analytic program is committed to explicitly to the project of analyzing one vocabulary in terms of another or explaining one vocabulary in terms of another, then is all philosophy analytic philosophy? And secondly, what is the alternative to analytic pragmatism if it's sufficient for a pragmatism to be analytic pragmatism that it sees as its part of its core organizing doctrine some version of the pragmatic maxim, which, by the way, it seems to me that if you're looking for a thread that's running through Peirce, James, Dewey, C.I. Lewis, all the way through Quine and Davidson and Hugh Price and Cheryl Mesack and Susan Hawke, it's that they disagree over what the pragmatic maxim is.
Right.
They don't disagree that the pragmatic maxim is the core of the story.
Right.
That the central way, the core thought is that whatever vocabulary and practices of deploying a vocabulary that is to be, or that are to be subjected to philosophical reflection, analysis, the way of conducting that reflection and analysis is to look at that vocabulary and the practices of using it in terms of practical actions, aims, ambitions, making changes in the world. That looks like it's not exclusive to pragmatism, but that is the thread that holds them all together.
Good. So you might say it's a requirement for being a pragmatist, but it doesn't exclusively make you a pragmatist.
Right.
So I think that so I think that lots of folks in the phenomenological tradition share this aspiration. A lot of folks in even the Platonic program has got a certain version of this.
Certainly, ordinary language philosophers are going to hold
got this. And so the case that it merges with the analytic program is that it at the very least shares similar kinds of ambitions. And notice, by the way, that all of the other features of the analytic program are ones that really have to do with just what kinds of languages we want to be our target languages. And notice, by the way, that even within the analytic program, there's no agreement about what the target language that we're using as our analysans should be, right? I mean, it looks like there's plenty of debate internal to that program as to what that is. So the merge narrative is one that also could be made with the phenomenological program. The merge narrative can be done also with, you might say, the structuralist histories and things like that. The merge narrative could be done also with, you might say, the Foucauldian program and so on. That kind of structural story is one that allows us to be able to see a lot of these programs as being in conversation.
Well, I don't.
So then, why is it controversial?
Right.
We'll have to spend another episode on what exactly the controversies are, won't we?
That's what the clock is saying.